On the evening of September 1st, 1974, Ruth Grayson Smith walked into a campsite less than a mile from her own front door and felt something drop inside her chest. Her daughter Belinda, her son-in-law Richard, her 5-year-old grandson David, and her 5-month-old granddaughter Melissa were supposed to be at her house for dinner. They were late. She told herself it was nothing. Families run late. Richard probably lost track of time down at the river, or the kids needed another hour, or Belinda just wanted one more evening under the trees before packing everything up and going back to ordinary life. Then she saw the campsite. The family truck sat exactly where it had been parked. The keys were in plain sight. Richard's wallet was on the table, cash still inside, not a dollar missing. Their clothes were folded neatly near the tent. The only things not accounted for were their bathing suits. And sitting on the picnic table, barely warmer than the moment it left the store's cooler, was a carton of milk. Ruth knew this milk. Richard and 5-year-old David had walked into the Copper General Store, the store where Ruth herself worked, at 9 o'clock that same morning and bought it. She may have watched them walk out the door with it. And now, 8 or 9 hours later, it was sitting on a table in an empty campsite, and her daughter and her grandchildren were nowhere. They had vanished in the space of a single afternoon. Somewhere between 9 in the morning and dinner time, in a window of just a few hours, a family of 4 had ceased to exist. And the milk they had bought that morning was still cold enough to drink. Ruth called for help. Law enforcement arrived, and the search began that same night. And the next morning brought a detail so heartbreaking it stops you cold. The family's pet basset hound, Droopy, was found scratching at the front door of the Copper General Store, the very store where Ruth worked, the last place Richard and David had been seen alive. The dog had found his way back to the only place that felt familiar, to the door of the woman who was now standing in a campsite trying to understand what she was looking at. He had come back alone, and that told everyone who needed to know that wherever the family had gone, they had not gone willingly. Richard Cowden was 28 years old. He had been born on October 9th, 1946, and he had built a life that looked, from the outside, like exactly what a young man in 1974 was supposed to build. A wife, a family, a late summer camping trip in Southern Oregon, close enough to Ruth's place that it barely counted as going far from home. Belinda was 22. David James Phillips, her son from a previous relationship, was 5, old enough to be thrilled by the campfire at night, young enough to think that catching a frog was the greatest achievement a person could accomplish. Melissa Dawn Cowden had been alive for 5 months. She had been born in the spring and had made it to summer, and someone had brought her into these trees, and she had never come back out. Search teams moved through the forest in expanding grids. Dogs were brought in. Other campers in the area were interviewed, and one detail surfaced early that went into the file and stayed there. A family visiting from Los Angeles reported something that had made them uneasy during those same hours. 2 men and a woman in a green pickup truck who had parked near their site and lingered in a way that made them uncomfortable enough to remember the truck's description. Investigators noted it carefully, because that description matched a vehicle owned by the parents of a man whose name would soon become central to everything. The search continued for days, then weeks, then months. At nearly 1.8 million acres, the Rogue River Siskiyou National Forest is a brutal terrain of steep ravines, dense timber, and hidden rock formations that swallow distance and silent sound. Search teams did what they could. They found nothing. For 7 months, the Cowden family was simply gone. Ruth went to work at the Copper General Store and came home and went to sleep and woke up and did it again, every day, carrying the image of that campsite and that carton of milk in the absence where her daughter and her grandchildren should have been. There was no resolution, no fixed point to grief. She was left suspended in the dark, waiting for information that wasn't coming, hoping for an answer she was already beginning to fear. The answer came on April 12, 1975. Gold prospectors working a steep hillside roughly 7 miles from the original campsite found something that stopped them where they stood. Richard Cowden's body was there, tied to a tree, not collapsed near a trail or at the bottom of a ravine. Tied to the trunk of a tree on a remote hillside that no casual hiker would ever reach by accident, 7 miles from where his family had eaten breakfast on the last morning anyone could account for them. The prospectors looked further. Nearby, hidden inside a narrow rock crevice, a dark, low opening cut into the hillside, they found Belinda, David, and Melissa, a mother and her 2 children, concealed close together inside the darkness of the crevice, in a location you would have to know was there or stumble upon by extraordinary chance. With those discoveries, any lingering hope of a tragic accident vanished. This was an execution. A man tied to a tree. A mother and her children hidden in a cave. 7 miles of deliberate distance between the bodies and the campsite. This required planning. This required knowledge of the terrain. Whoever had done this had moved 4 people through difficult wilderness, had chosen that specific hillside and that specific crevice, and had left them there with the confidence that they might not be found for a very long time. That confidence was almost justified. It held for 7 months. The medical examiner's findings were specific where they could be, and incomplete where months of exposure to the elements had erased the clues. Richard's cause of death could not be definitively established, but the examiner determined that Belinda and 5-year-old David had been shot with a .22 caliber rifle, a conclusion specific enough to become one of the central threads of the investigation going forward. Melissa, 5 months old, had died from head trauma. The examiner recorded those findings, and investigators now had something concrete, a specific caliber, a .22. Something to look for when they started looking at people. And one person kept coming up. Dwayne Lee Little was not a stranger to the police. His history didn't begin with the Cowdens, and it didn't begin in 1974. In 1964, a full decade before that campsite was found empty, Little had been convicted of murder. The victim was a woman named Orla Faye Phipps. He had served time, moved through the corrections system, and been released on parole. In the summer of 1974, while Richard Cowden was packing his family into a truck for a camping trip near Copper, Oregon, Dwayne Lee Little was a convicted murderer out on parole and present in those same woods. And investigators didn't have to rely solely on the green truck report from the Los Angeles family to place him there. At a nearby miner's cabin, investigators found a guest book. Signed on September 2, 1974, the day after the Cowden family vanished, were the names of Dwayne Lee Little and his parents. He had been in those woods that exact weekend. His parents' vehicle matched the description of the green pickup truck that had made the family from Los Angeles nervous enough to remember it. And investigators noted one final, chilling detail. Shortly after that weekend, Little was seen thoroughly cleaning out the back of that truck. The timeline, the geography, the vehicle, the guest book signature, the truck cleaning, all of it lined up in a way that could not be dismissed as coincidence. Investigators built the case that the available evidence would support. It pointed consistently in one direction. But suspicion is not the same as evidence, and in a crime scene exposed to 7 months of Pacific Northwest weather, proof was almost impossible to find. Little was never charged in connection with the murders of the Cowden family. He was released. He moved through the years that followed as a free man, years that Richard and Belinda and David and Melissa did not have and would never have. And then, in 1980, he gave investigators the confirmation they had been carrying as a belief for 6 years. In 1980, Little attacked a young woman named Margie Hunter. She was 23 years old and 7 months pregnant. What he did to her was horrific. A kidnapping, a brutal sexual assault, an attempt to ensure she never told anyone what had happened. The parallel to the Cowden case was not lost on investigators. A predator, isolated terrain, a vulnerable victim, overwhelming violence. But this time, something was different. Margie Hunter fought back. She survived, and she lived to stand up and testify against him in court, doing what the Cowden case had never been able to do. Her courage, her survival, her testimony, that was what finally secured a conviction. Attempted murder, kidnapping, sexual assault. Little was sent to prison, and this time, he would never leave. That conviction proved what investigators had believed since 1974. It showed that his 1964 murder of Orla Faye Phipps had not been an isolated event, that the violence was a pattern, deliberate and predatory, expressed against vulnerable people across more than 15 years. A convicted murderer paroled in time to encounter a family in the woods. A pregnant woman attacked 6 years later. The pattern was clear, consistent, and documented. It was just documented for a different case, in a different courtroom, for different victims. For the Cowden family, the law had still never spoken. He is currently 80 years old, serving out his life sentence in an Oregon prison, convicted for crimes that investigators are convinced are not the worst things he ever did, in a case that is not the one they most wanted to close. The Cowden murders remain officially unsolved. That is the legal reality of this case, and it has been the legal reality for 50 years. The file is open. The charge has never come. Investigators who have worked this case across the decades carry the same belief they have always carried, that they know what happened on that September afternoon in 1974, and that the proof required to say it in a courtroom has never materialized in the form the law demands. But investigators aren't finished yet. DNA analysis has reopened cases sealed for longer than this one. Guestbook entries and truck descriptions and caliber findings have been enough, in other cases, to anchor a prosecution when new technology connects old dots. Witnesses who spent decades silent have finally spoken. These things happen in cases that looked exactly as closed as this one looks today. Whether that happens here is a question nobody outside the investigation can answer. What can be answered is simpler and sadder than any of the forensic details. On the morning of September 1st, 1974, a 28-year-old man named Richard walked into the Copper General store with a 5-year-old boy at his side and bought a carton of milk. Ruth Grayson Smith may have been working that shift. She may have handed him his change and watched him walk back out into the late summer morning, heading back to the campsite where his wife and his infant daughter were waiting. That evening, she drove to that campsite for dinner and found the milk still sitting on the table. She found the keys. She found the wallet. She found the clothes folded near the tent. She found everything except the people she had come to see. The next morning, their dog came back alone. A suspect exists, placed in those woods by his own signature in a guest book, connected to the scene by a truck that witnesses remembered and described, seen thoroughly cleaning that same truck in the days that followed. According to official investigators, the Cowden murders remain unsolved, and Dwayne Lee Little has never been charged. That is the only verdict the system has produced. Ruth Smith walked into that campsite on the evening of September 1st, 1974, and saw a carton of milk sitting on a table and realized, with a sudden, cold certainty, that her world had just shattered. She was right. And 50 years later, the answer that would mean something in a courtroom, in the language the law requires, in the only forum that could give it the weight it deserves, that answer still hasn't come.